One of the most controversial forces in modern finance, private equity. And really, it's a story with two very different sides: a brilliant financial playbook and the steep price that sometimes gets paid for its success.
So let's just jump right in with a question. Think about some of these huge brands you definitely know. Toys R Us, Hertz, Royal Mail. On the surface, they seem totally unrelated, right? But what do they actually have in common?
Well, the one thing that connects them is that at one point or another, they were all bought out by a private equity firm. This is this huge financial engine that's been reshaping entire industries, a lot of the time completely behind the scenes. So, what even is private equity? You can think of it as a giant pool of money from big-time investors. We're talking pension funds, university endowments, that kind of thing. And they use that cash to buy companies. But here's the absolute key. They don't just sit back and collect checks. No, they take a super active, hands-on role in completely restructuring the business from the inside out.
Okay, so how do they actually pull this off? To get that, we've got to open up the private equity playbook. Their signature move, the strategy that pretty much defines the entire industry, is something called the leveraged buyout. You'll hear it called an LBO. And the name itself, well, it kind of gives the game away.
And the secret is right there in the name, leverage, which, is really just a fancy way of saying debt. A lot of debt. In a typical LBO, a shocking 60 to 80% of the money used to buy the company isn't the PE firm's money at all. It's borrowed.
Let's just walk through a quick example so you can see how this works. Say a PE firm wants to buy XYZ Industrial for $11 billion. Okay, step one, they only put in, say, $2 billion of their own investors' cash. Step two, they go borrow the other $9 billion. And here is the craziest part. That huge loan, it gets put on XYZ Industrial's books, not the private equity firms. Then, step three, they get to work making the company leaner, more profitable. And finally, step four, a few years down the road, they sell it, maybe for $13 billion, they pay back the loan, and poof, they just turned their $2 billion investment into a massive profit.
So how do they actually create all that new value in step three? Well, they've basically got four main levers they can pull. They try to grow revenues, for sure. They cut costs to expand their profit margins. They use the company's own cash flow to pay down all that debt they took on. And then, the grand finale, they sell the company for a higher price than they paid for it. So that's the playbook. And listen, from a pure numbers perspective, it is an incredibly powerful model for making money. But all that efficiency comes with some really serious debate and criticism. It's time to flip the coin over and look at the other side. Because, when you load a company up with that much debt, it becomes incredibly fragile. There's just no room for error. And that is where the dark side of this playbook really starts to show. Critics will point to a whole pattern of really serious risks. The mountain of debt makes these companies super vulnerable to any kind of economic slump. And because the company is taken private, they stop all public reporting, which creates this black box. To pay off the debt, you often see what critics call asset stripping, or sometimes major layoffs. And in the worst-case scenarios, it can drive once healthy companies, think of Toys R Us, straight into bankruptcy. And this really gets to the heart of the whole debate. You see, what a PE firm calls margin expansion and just good old efficiency, critics will turn around and call asset stripping. One side's strategic cost reduction is the other side's hollowing out a company for a quick buck, leaving it way weaker for the long haul. Okay, a perfect example of this is this really controversial move called a dividend recapitulation. This is where the company, the one that's already drowning in debt from the buyout, is forced to borrow even more money. But that new cash isn't for new factories or research. Nope. It's used to pay a giant one-time cash payout directly to the private equity owners themselves. And a quote from one of the sources we looked at just nails the outcome of this. It says, "What remains is a financially weakened entity burdened with obligations incurred for the benefit of its former owners." Oof. Now, you might be thinking this all sounds like a problem for, just a few individual companies. But the reason this is so important right now is that private equity isn't some tiny corner of the financial world anymore. Its scale has created what might be a system-sized problem. I mean, how big are we talking? Globally, private equity firms have more than $2 trillion in assets they're managing. It is an absolutely dominant force in our economy. And that's the thing. With that kind of scale, the risks aren't isolated anymore. This playbook is being run on thousands and thousands of companies all at once in critical sectors. I'm talking healthcare, manufacturing, you name it.
And critics are warning this creates systemic risks for all of us. First, it can make economic cycles way more extreme, basically making booms bigger and busts way more severe. Public pension funds have billions tied up in these risky investments, and because it's so opaque, regulators can't even see the risk building up inside what some call a shadow banking system. Plus, the strategy of buying up all the competitors can lead to monopolies, and that's not good for anyone.
So this all leads to the one big fear. What happens if there's a major economic shock and thousands of these companies, all loaded with debt, all across the economy, get into serious trouble at the exact same time?
And all of this brings us right to the great debate, the fundamental question that private equity forces us to ask about our economy.
So you've got one side, the proponents, who say, hey, this imposes market discipline, it drives real efficiency, it unlocks value in sleepy, underperforming companies. And then you've got the critics on the other side, warning that it hollows out those companies, operates in the dark, and now it could even threaten the stability of the whole economy.
At the end of the day, we're left with this massive conflict, a model that's designed to squeeze out the absolute maximum financial value for investors versus the need for our broader economy to be resilient and stable for everyone.
And so the question it really leaves us with is this. When we talk about what powers our economy, what's the right balance between ruthless efficiency and long-term stability?